China built an oil pipeline network that bypasses every ocean on Earth. Right now, while the Strait of Hormuz sits paralyzed and oil prices are tearing past $100 a barrel, China's refineries are running at full capacity. Its factories haven't missed a beat. Because 2 decades ago, China looked at a map, saw that 80% of its oil arrived by sea, and decided that was a problem it was going to solve permanently. Not with a navy, not with diplomacy, but with steel buried deep in the ground across 4 countries. The choke point trap picture, the early 2000s. China is the fastest growing economy on the planet. Its factories are running around the clock. Its cities are expanding faster than anyone thought possible, and its appetite for oil is growing with every passing year. And nearly 80% of every barrel it imports is traveling by sea. You heard that right, 80%. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the same as the entire United States depending on a single 2-lane highway to receive every drop of fuel it needs to function. One blockage, and the whole country stops. But here's what makes that number truly terrifying. That oil isn't just traveling across open water. It's being funneled through 3 of the most dangerous bottlenecks on the planet: the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and the Lombok Strait. These aren't wide-open stretches of ocean. These are narrow, congested, militarily contested corridors where a single conflict, a single hostile navy, or a single well-placed decision by a foreign power could shut the flow off completely. The Strait of Malacca is just 1.5 miles wide at its narrowest point. 1.5 miles. The strait carries nearly a quarter of all global trade and the majority of China's seaborne oil imports, and it's sandwiched between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, with the United States Navy patrolling the broader region. China doesn't control it. China has no say in whether it stays open. And that reality was sitting in the minds of Chinese strategists like a ticking clock. The Strait of Hormuz is even more loaded. Roughly 20% of all global oil supply passes through that corridor every single day. It connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world, and it's bordered by Iran on one side and the Arabian Peninsula on the other. The geopolitical tension baked into that geography has never fully cooled, and China knew that any escalation between the United States and Iran, any regional war, any miscalculation, could close that strait in hours. 20% of the world's oil supply gone, just like that. And this was the trap China found itself in, not because of anything it had done wrong, not because of a bad decision or a failed strategy, but simply because of geography, because the oil fields China needed were thousands of miles away, and the only paths connecting them ran through corridors controlled by other powers or policed by a navy that belonged to its primary geopolitical rival. But the problem ran even deeper than geography. This was the era when American naval dominance was essentially unchallenged. The United States had carrier strike groups positioned across the Indo-Pacific, a network of military alliances threading through the region, and the demonstrated willingness to use maritime pressure as a geopolitical tool. China's leadership understood something that wasn't being said out loud in diplomatic circles. In a serious conflict, the United States didn't need to fire a single shot at China's mainland to bring its economy to its knees. All it had to do was close the Malacca Strait. Refineries would run dry within weeks. Factories would go dark within months. The entire engine of Chinese economic growth, the thing that was lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and funding China's rise as a global power, was sitting exposed, dependent on corridors it couldn't protect and couldn't afford to lose. Chinese Admiral Liu Huaqing had a name for this vulnerability. He called it the Malacca Dilemma. And once that phrase entered the strategic conversation, it never left. It became the organizing anxiety behind 2 decades of Chinese infrastructure investment, diplomatic maneuvering, and engineering ambition. Here's what you need to understand about that moment. China didn't panic. It didn't launch an aggressive naval buildup overnight, though that would come later. Instead, it asked a quieter and more dangerous question. What if you could move oil without using the ocean at all? What if you could thread pipelines across deserts, mountain ranges, permafrost, and politically complex territories and build a supply network that no navy on Earth could touch? That question didn't stay theoretical for long, and the first answer came from a direction most people never expected: the vast, landlocked steppe of Central Asia. Steel across the steppe Kazakhstan doesn't look like the answer to an energy crisis. It's landlocked, sparsely populated, and sits in the middle of a continent so vast that most people couldn't place it on a map without help. But underneath its steppe, that endless, wind-swept grassland stretching across more than 1 million square miles, sits one of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. The Kashagan field alone holds an estimated 38 billion barrels of oil. And in the early 2000s, China came knocking. The China-Kazakhstan crude oil pipeline doesn't get talked about the way it should. It stretches over 600 miles from the Atasu Junction in central Kazakhstan to the Alashankou border crossing in China's Xinjiang province, and it was the first major overland oil pipeline China had ever built outside its own borders. When it came online in 2006, it was a proof of concept, a signal that China wasn't just talking about energy security. It was building it, 1 mile of steel at a time. But building a pipeline across the Kazakh steppe is not a simple engineering exercise. The terrain swings between brutal extremes, scorching summers that push past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and winters that plunge to -40. The ground shifts. The permafrost in certain sections heaves and contracts with the seasons in ways that can crack steel if the engineering isn't precise. And the sheer remoteness of the route means that every piece of equipment, every worker, every supply chain has to be managed across distances that would break most logistics operations before they even got started. China didn't flinch. It brought in the engineers, negotiated the agreements, and laid the pipe. And here's where the strategy reveals itself. Because China didn't just build a pipeline, it built a relationship. The deal that came with the pipeline included Chinese investment in Kazakh oil fields, infrastructure development agreements, and long-term supply contracts that tied Kazakhstan's economic future directly to Chinese demand. Kazakhstan wasn't just selling oil anymore. It was plugged into a Chinese-built system, and unplugging from that system would cost it more than it could afford. But Kazakhstan was only the opening move. Because while that pipeline was still being laid, China was already negotiating something far larger to its north. The Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline, known as Espo, is one of the longest oil pipelines ever built. It stretches over 3,000 miles from the oil fields of eastern Siberia all the way to the Russian Pacific coast, with a critical spur line branching directly south into China's Daqing refinery complex. When the Chinese spur came fully online, it was delivering over 600,000 barrels of Russian crude every single day overland, directly into Chinese refineries, without touching a single ocean. The engineering challenge here was in a different category entirely. The Espo pipeline crosses some of the most geologically punishing terrain on Earth. Over 1,000 river and stream crossings, active seismic zones where the ground itself is unreliable. And then there's the permafrost, hundreds of miles of frozen ground that behaves like solid rock in winter and unstable mud in summer. Building a pipeline that could survive that environment without rupturing required engineering solutions that didn't fully exist yet when the project began. China and Russia had to develop them as they went, and then came the most consequential part of the deal, the financing. China gave Russia a $25 billion loan in exchange for guaranteed oil supplies delivered through the pipeline over 20 years. Think about what that means. Russia needed the money. China needed the oil. And the pipeline was the physical manifestation of an agreement that locked both countries into interdependence, an interdependence that would only deepen with time. And that would prove strategically decisive decades later, when Western sanctions tried to isolate Russia from global energy markets. What you're watching, across both of these pipelines, is the same pattern repeating. China identifies a supplier, offers infrastructure investment and financing that the supplier can't match anywhere else, builds the physical connection, and then writes long-term agreements that make the relationship almost impossible to reverse. It's not charity, it's architecture. China is building a system where the flow of oil toward its refineries is the default state, and disrupting that flow requires the supplying nation to dismantle its own economic infrastructure to do it. But as audacious as Kazakhstan and Russia were, they were still solving for the eastern and northern routes. The western vulnerability, the Strait of Malacca, was still open. And China's solution to that problem was about to get a lot more surgical. The Malacca kill switch, the Strait of Malacca, is the reason Myanmar matters. On its own, Myanmar is a small, politically fractured country wedged between India, China, and Southeast Asia. Not the kind of place that typically shows up in conversations about global energy strategy. But look at a map long enough, and something clicks. Myanmar has a coastline on the Bay of Bengal, and the Bay of Bengal sits on the other side of the Malacca Strait, from China. Which means that if you could build a pipeline from Myanmar's coast to China's interior, you could move oil from the Indian Ocean directly into Chinese refineries without passing through Malacca at all. That's exactly what China built. The China-Myanmar crude oil pipeline stretches over 700 miles from the deepwater port of Kyaukphyu on Myanmar's western state coast, cutting northeast through Myanmar's mountainous interior and crossing the border into China's Yunnan province. When it came online in 2017, it instantly gave China the ability to offload supertankers arriving from the Middle East and Africa on Myanmar's coast and pump that oil directly overland into its refining network. The Malacca Strait, for those barrels at least, simply ceased to exist. But building this pipeline nearly broke every rule of what's considered possible in infrastructure engineering. The route doesn't cross flat steppe or frozen tundra. It crosses the Arakan Mountains, one of the most rugged and seismically active mountain ranges in Asia. The pipeline has to navigate elevation changes of thousands of feet, cross hundreds of rivers and gorges, and move through terrain so dense and remote that construction crews sometimes had to be airlifted to their own work sites. In certain sections, the ground shifts so unpredictably that the pipeline had to be engineered with built-in flexibility steel that can absorb movement without cracking. Anchoring systems designed to hold position even when the earth underneath them decides to move. And then there's the political complexity, because Myanmar in the 2000s was not a stable, cooperative partner. It was a country under military rule, internationally isolated, and sitting in the middle of multiple active ethnic conflicts. Several of the pipeline's construction zones passed directly through regions where armed groups operated and where the central government's control was, at best, theoretical. China had to negotiate not just with the government in Naypyidaw, but with local power brokers, tribal leaders, and regional commanders, who each had their own conditions for allowing steel to be laid through their territory. This is where the pattern from Kazakhstan and Russia shows up again, but sharper. China didn't just pay for the pipeline. It invested in the Kyaukphyu Special Economic Zone, funded road construction along the pipeline corridor, and plugged Myanmar's government into a web of Chinese financing that made the relationship load-bearing for Myanmar's economy. By the time the pipeline was operational, Myanmar wasn't just a transit country. It was a country whose economic architecture had been partially built by China, around Chinese priorities, using Chinese money. Reversing that relationship would mean dismantling infrastructure that Myanmar's own development depended on. But here's what makes this pipeline different from Kazakhstan and Russia, and what makes it the most strategically elegant piece of the entire network. The China-Myanmar pipeline doesn't just bypass the Malacca Strait. It changes the geometry of Chinese vulnerability entirely. Before this pipeline, every barrel of Middle Eastern and African oil heading to China had to make the same journey around the tip of the Malay Peninsula, through a 1.5-mile wide choke point, and up through the South China Sea. One closure point, one vulnerability, one loaded gun. After this pipeline, China has an alternative route already built, already operational, already pumping. The gun is still there, but China is no longer standing in front of it. And yet, for all its elegance, the Myanmar pipeline was still solving for the Malacca problem. The Hormuz problem, the Persian Gulf choke point, the one that controls 20% of global oil supply, was still sitting there, unsolved, still capable of bringing everything down. China had one more move to make, and it was the most audacious one yet. It involved a port on the Arabian Sea, a mountain range that touches the sky, and a corridor through one of the most dangerous pieces of real estate on the planet. The crown jewel there is a port on the southwestern coast of Pakistan that most people have never heard of. It sits on the Arabian Sea, just a few hundred miles from the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, in a region so remote and underdeveloped that for most of its history it was little more than a fishing village. Its name is Gwadar, and China spent over $60 billion turning it into the most strategically positioned piece of infrastructure on the planet. To understand why Gwadar matters, you need to understand the problem it solves. Even with the Kazakhstan pipeline, even with the Espo spur from Russia, even with the Myanmar route bypassing Malacca, China still had a Hormuz problem. The Persian Gulf is where the oil is. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, the UAE, they collectively sit on the largest concentration of proven oil reserves in human history. And every tanker leaving those fields has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to reach open water. There was no overland alternative. There was no pipeline that could reach those fields without crossing territory China didn't control. Until China decided to build one starting from the Arabian Sea and working backward. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC) is officially described as an economic development initiative. Roads, railways, power plants, infrastructure investment across Pakistan connecting Gwadar in the south to China's Xinjiang province in the north, and all of that is real. But inside that development framework, threaded through the roads and the power stations and the fiber optic cables, runs an oil pipeline corridor that gives China something it has never had before. A direct overland connection to a warm water port on the Arabian Sea, 2,500 miles, closer to the Persian Gulf than any point on China's own coastline. But getting there requires crossing the Karakoram mountain range. And the Karakoram is not a mountain range that forgives engineering arrogance. It contains some of the highest peaks on Earth outside of the Himalayas. The Karakoram Highway, the route CPEC largely follows, sits at elevations above 15,000 feet in places, crosses terrain that experiences violent seismic activity, and passes through sections where landslides can bury a road overnight. Winter closures are not the exception. They are the standard. Construction crews working in these conditions face altitude sickness, extreme cold, rockfall, and the constant reality that the ground beneath their equipment is geologically unstable in ways that no survey can fully predict. And then there's the security dimension, because CPEC doesn't just cross mountains. It crosses Baluchistan, one of Pakistan's most politically volatile provinces, where a long-running insurgency has targeted infrastructure projects and Chinese workers specifically. China had to negotiate security arrangements with the Pakistani military, fund the deployment of a dedicated security force to protect the corridor, and build the pipeline infrastructure in an environment where attacks on construction sites were not hypothetical. They happened. Workers died. And China kept building. This is the part that reveals the true scale of China's strategic commitment, because any rational cost-benefit analysis, looking purely at construction risk and security exposure, would have killed this project before it started. The engineering is brutally expensive. The security requirements are open-ended. The political complexity of routing through Pakistan, a country with its own internal fractures and a relationship with the United States that adds layers of geopolitical sensitivity, makes every negotiation harder than it should be. But China wasn't doing a cost-benefit analysis on the pipeline in isolation. It was doing a cost-benefit analysis on what it costs to remain vulnerable to Hormuz. And that number, the number attached to having 20% of your oil supply sitting behind a choke point you don't control, in a region where conflict is always one miscalculation away, that number is so large it makes the Karakoram look cheap. When the Gwadar port connection became operational, China had done something no other major power had ever attempted. It had built a complete overland energy network north, east, and west that could keep its refineries running even if every major maritime choke point on Earth closed simultaneously. But for years, the world called it vanity, debt trap diplomacy, overreach, geopolitical theater dressed up as infrastructure. Then came 2026, and the world stopped laughing. The proof: it's 2026. The Strait of Hormuz is in crisis. Tensions between the United States and Iran have escalated past the point of diplomatic management, and the corridor that carries 20% of the world's daily oil supply has effectively seized up. Tankers are holding position outside the Gulf, unwilling to risk the passage. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting the route have gone vertical. Spot prices for crude have blown past $100 a barrel and kept climbing. Energy ministers across Europe, Japan, South Korea, and India are staring at supply projections that make for genuinely frightening reading. And China? China is buying oil at contracted prices through pipelines that have never stopped pumping, while the rest of the world is scrambling, calling emergency OPEC meetings, releasing strategic reserves. Watching their currencies slide against a spiking oil price, China's refinery utilization rates are holding steady. Its manufacturing sector hasn't missed a production cycle. The economic shock that is radiating outward from the Hormuz crisis and hitting every other major economy is landing on China like a wave hitting a seawall. It's registering. But it isn't breaking anything. This is the payoff of 2 decades of work that the world spent 2 decades misreading. Because here's what the world got wrong about Belt and Road. The dominant narrative, the one that ran through Western think tanks, financial institutions, and foreign policy circles for years, was that China was spending money it couldn't justify on infrastructure that made no economic sense, in countries that couldn't repay the loans. To project influence it didn't know how to use. Debt trap diplomacy, they called it. Vanity infrastructure. The kind of overreach that historically precedes a great power's decline rather than its rise. But that analysis was looking at the wrong variable. It was measuring Belt and Road against a standard commercial return on investment framework. And by that standard, yes, some of the projects looked questionable. What it wasn't measuring was strategic return. What it wasn't asking was, what is it worth to never be held hostage by the Strait of Malacca again? What is it worth to have a warm water Arabian Sea outlet that sidesteps Hormuz entirely? What is it worth to have Russia and Kazakhstan locked into supply agreements so deep that reversing them would require those countries to dismantle their own economic infrastructure? The answer to those questions isn't denominated in dollars. It's denominated in exactly what you're watching right now: an oil crisis that is reshaping the global economy, and a China that is navigating it from a position of structural insulation that no other major power can match. And this is what makes the full picture so staggering when you finally see it clearly. China didn't build a pipeline network. It built a new geography. It took the map that every other power had accepted as fixed the map where the Persian Gulf's oil flows through Hormuz, where Asian trade flows through Malacca, where landlocked energy producers have no choice but to sell through maritime corridors, and it rewrote it quietly over 20 years, one pipeline at a time. The Kazakhstan route gave it Central Asian crude, independent of any ocean. The Espo spur gave Russian barrels delivered directly to its refineries without a single nautical mile of exposure. The Myanmar pipeline killed the Malacca vulnerability for Indian Ocean oil. And Gwadar, the fishing village on the Arabian Sea that China turned into a strategic masterstroke, gave it a warm water outlet so close to the Persian Gulf that the Hormuz closure that is currently paralyzing global energy markets is, for Chinese supply chains, little more than a rerouting calculation. Every pipeline China built came with ports, roads, financing agreements, and economic dependencies that locked supplying nations into orbits around Chinese infrastructure. Every project the world dismissed as geopolitical theater was in fact load-bearing. Every dollar spent on the Karakoram, on the Kazakh steppe, on the mountains of Myanmar, was a dollar spent on a future where no foreign navy, no sanctions regime, and no choke point closure gets to decide whether China's lights stay on. That future is now, and it's running at full capacity.